Morning. Glad for the opportunity to be here again this morning. And my notes are sitting on Ken and Ava's table, so we're going to see how this goes. If you would open your Bibles to Ezekiel 37, at least you don't have to turn very far today. I'm going to stay right there. If you remember Ezekiel 37, it's the prophecy, the Valley of Dry Bones. You may remember this. There's a valley full of dry bones, and something happens to them that is a lesson to the people of Israel. But before we get too far into that, let's go back and consider what was going on at this point in time. This was during the Babylonian captivity, along with some time period when Babylon was still conquering part of Judah. If you remember your prophets very well, I don't remember all of them as well as I perhaps should, but Isaiah was the prophet to the northern kingdom. He spoke to them about what was going to happen with the captivity. Jeremiah was the primary prophet in the southern kingdom, speaking to Judah for decades, telling them, you need to change. If you do not change, this is the outcome you will face. And for a great many years, they doubted him, they ridiculed him, they imprisoned him, they tried very hard to shut him up, and use false prophets to say, Jeremiah, you're out of your mind. That's not going to happen. Sit down and shut up. And throughout that time period, it didn't matter what God tried to tell them, what he tried to relate to them. They just would not listen, and ultimately we know they ended up in captivity. Well, during this time, Ezekiel is a prophet, but not in the northern or the southern kingdom. Rather, he is among the captives who have already been taken to Babylon or dispersed throughout the various places that Babylon sent them. So a lot of what he was speaking were to fellow Jews who were already slaves under the Babylon Empire. And so much of what he had to say was, this is what's happening, but also, here is your future. Here's what you can expect both of your captivity and of a brighter future. And in this particular chapter, this is, in fact, a brighter future for them, though the imagery is very dark to begin with. It becomes very bright at the end. And so it is actually a chapter of much hope and of much promise and benefit to them. And we won't read the entire chapter, but to kind of get our minds around what is happening in both the dark nature of it as well as the turning point, we'll read verses 1 through 11. So in verses 1 through 11, we have the prophecy of the Valley of Dry Bones. It begins, the hand of Jehovah was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of Jehovah, and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he caused me to pass by them round about, and behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord Jehovah, you know. Again he said unto me, Prophesy over these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of Jehovah. Thus saith the Lord Jehovah unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and ye shall live, and ye shall know that I am Jehovah. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, and behold, an earthquake, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. And I beheld, and lo, there were sinews upon them. And flesh came up, and skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them. Then said he unto me, Prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, son of man, and say to the wind, Thus says the Lord Jehovah, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We are clean, cut off. And so you can kind of imagine what he's saying. It sounds like something you might see in a movie. I mean, nowadays, with our ability to use computers for 3D animations, you would expect this to be something in a fanciful movie, that you'd see this valley full of bones, and then suddenly springing to life. And notice what Ezekiel is seeing here, and how amazing this must have been to him. It says that the Spirit led him through the valley, that basically God's guiding him and pushing him along. I want you to see this, Ezekiel. And we get the idea that it wasn't just a few bones. This was not just, there's some here and some there. There were many There's a vast multitude. Just imagine that, stacked bones upon bones, just piled who knows how high and how far and how vast. If I cough, you have to wait on me. You can't just keep going without me. Sorry. But he looks, and not only does he see these bones, but it says they're very dry. Now, we've all seen bones after you go to a chicken place and you eat the chicken off of them, and they still look kind of moist. And perhaps they still have a little bit of chicken on there, maybe some gristle, something you don't really want to eat, so you just kind of discard it. But there's still something to these bones. There's still some amount of a life to them, you can say, even though the chicken is long dead. But these bones are dry. They're not just a little bit dead. They're not just a little bit past expiration. They are exceedingly dry. There is nothing left to say there's life here. In fact, you might imagine tumbleweeds going through this open valley and dust traveling throughout, and that's as much life as there is in this valley. And that's what he's saying. He's saying that there's nothing here. And God says to him, can these bones live? Right? God's saying, I don't know. What do you think, Ezekiel? Do you think it's possible? Maybe? Well, of course not. God doesn't ask a question to which he does not know the answer. If God asks a question, of course he knows the answer, but he wants you to think about it. He wants you to ponder the meaning of it. Ezekiel, seeing these bones, seeing that there's not even a vestige of life to them, they are useless, absolutely useless in their current state. Can these bones somehow live again? Is it possible, Ezekiel? And Ezekiel, being obviously humble enough, says, oh Lord, you know. I don't know. I'm a man. How would I possibly know if this is even remotely possible? Not that he doubts God, but he's saying, I am not in a state to answer this question. I simply do not know the answer, God. You know better than me, is essentially what he's saying. And I don't think there's arrogance there. I don't think there's doubt. I think it's Ezekiel saying, Lord, if it's possible with you, yes, but I just simply do not know. I cannot answer. And from here is when the Lord tells him, well, now you need to speak to these bones. You need to talk to the bones. And we say, well, wait a minute. You're prophesying. God's giving you this vision. Why didn't he just have you go talk to the people? Because he's already had Ezekiel talk to the people over and over. There's been different visions, of course. If you look back at chapter 1, the vision is of a very majestic scene of the throne of God. You see these 4 beasts with different faces on each side of an eagle and of a man and an ox, and I believe a bear, if I'm not mistaken. And each one of them is able to walk about, not independently of each other, but with each other, walking forward, backwards, side to side, each having various wings, 2 carving themselves, 2 moving about, and then these wheels that are, I guess, below them, if I remember correctly. And it's a great vision. There's this blue, I often in the past thought it was kind of a red, but it's this blue throne, this beautiful royal blue throne you can imagine. And it gives them these visions to see that the people could recognize as something powerful. But in a lot of other cases, he says, Ezekiel, just go tell them flat out, this is what God is doing, this is what's going to happen, this is your future. In this case, he's talking to the bones. He's not talking directly to the people. Why would he do that? Well, we get the answer down around verse 11, that this is the house of Israel. And we see throughout the chapter the attitude of the people that hope is lost. As far as the people are concerned, we're in captivity and there is no hope left. We have disobeyed our God. He has written us off. He doesn't care about us anymore. That's it. That's the end of our nation, the end of our history, as far as they're concerned. God is saying, let's look at this from my perspective. We might very well be tempted to look at this chapter as a chapter about Ezekiel or about the people of Israel being restored, but really the chapter is about God. And in fact, if we look in the entire Bible, though we read about a great many people, and we often think, well, this is about this great person of faith or this person who sinned, ultimately, every chapter, every verse is about God. Because God, like a parent, looks upon and says, your focus often drifts from here to there. You miss out on what I'm trying to tell you. I want your focus here. If you're trying to teach a child to ride a bike, do you tell them to look around or do you tell them to look at you? If you're walking in front of them, they're riding, or if you're behind them, you're pushing, you're telling them focus on one point. That's what God is saying. Focus on me, focus on what I can do, not because he's trying to be arrogant, but because we are so distracted so easily. Focus. So he speaks to the bones. He calls for the bones to come together again. So when Ezekiel speaks down later in this set of verses, we see what happens. That bone attaches to bone. Can you imagine the sight? And this is where I can only imagine that what this looks like, and we can only hope to recreate some of it if we were to use our modern computers to create this scene, that so many bones, so dry and so lifeless, would just suddenly start moving into place until they're a bunch of skeletons. And these skeletons start gaining muscle and tissue and organs and blood vessels and skin upon them and just forming into a human being. Something very amazing to see. And human after human in rows and lines in various places. And he's seeing all this. And what an amazing sight it is to see what God is doing. And then to have to try and relate that to his fellow Jews, and then by extension us today. Can you really imagine what he must have seen? How impressive this must have been to Ezekiel's mind. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he sees them, but they're lifeless. There is some hope in the sense that they are now flesh and blood again, that they are a whole body, but there is still no life in them. The hope was not in the bone. The hope was not in the blood vessels, not in the muscle, not in the tissues or the organs. They still didn't have any life until the next part, when God says, okay, Ezekiel, I want you to call to the wind. I want you to call the four winds, that is north, south, east, and west, from every direction, come together and breathe upon these dead bodies, these lifeless bodies. And it's only after that that we see life restored. And not just that, we see a great noise. Well, what did we see in Acts chapter 2 when the Holy Spirit came upon the apostles? There was a great noise. This wasn't something that people missed. This wasn't something where suddenly, how did these guys start speaking in other tongues? It just kind of randomly happened. They were speaking in Aramaic or Hebrew, and suddenly they're speaking Greek and Latin and everything else. No, there was a great noise of a mighty rushing wind. It got their attention. Here God is getting Ezekiel's attention, and by extension the people later hearing it. There's a great noise and a great earthquake. This wasn't just something casual. This was something to say, man cannot do this. Your hope is not in yourselves. And when you sit there in despair about your future, O Israel, recognize, yes, you have no hope on your own. But when you trust in me, you have all the hope in the world. And so this great sight is of these bones coming together is eclipsed by a great earthquake and a great noise and the wind rushing through. Now where we live, there's not a lot of skyscrapers, and we frequently get 70-mile-an-hour winds coming through. And you can hear it sometimes on our house. You hear it. It is loud, and you about wonder if the house will stand up. In fact, it got to one time with the storm, that an insurance adjuster came the next day and said, you guys need a new roof. So we got a new roof, and we got it upgraded to something stronger, because this is frequent. This isn't just every once in a while. It may not be every day, but quite a few times throughout the year, you can expect to walk outside and about get blown over. That's pretty powerful. Imagine you're Ezekiel, and you hear the four winds coming. Must be akin to what he was seeing and feeling and hearing. And this wind comes into the bodies. And what does he describe happens after the wind comes into these bodies? What does he see? So in verse 10 it says, so I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Now, does that mean they all came up in their full bodies and now they have full armor with swords, spears, shields, helmets, chariots, and so forth? Well, let's not get ahead of God and presume that's what he's talking about. You're going to go from captivity to being a mighty army that's going to go conquering in some physical sense. Rather, what I believe Ezekiel is saying is the appearance of so many was like seeing an army coming. And like we said, Ezekiel is a prophet who is in captivity. It would seem to me that Ezekiel had lived in the land, perhaps faithfully, and then been deported into captivity. So he probably had a good idea of what the Babylonian army looked like from a distance. He's saying, it's like that. For those of you in captivity, those of you about to be, those who see this, it's like that. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and a great multitude. He said, this is what I saw. This wasn't just God saying, this auditorium full of people, I'm going to pick a couple of you guys to be freed from captivity. He's saying the time is coming when you guys will come from the four winds. You're going to come from everywhere that you've been enslaved. You're going to come back together in this physical land. And then we move down to verses 12 through 14, and it discusses that part a little bit more. It says, "Therefore prophesy and say to them, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, Behold, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves, O my people, and I will bring you into the land of Israel. I'm giving you life." Not physical life, because we know that a third were destroyed by famine or pestilence, a third were destroyed by the sword. You have a third or some remnant that was taken into captivity, and a handful that were left in the land. So a great many of them were already physically dead. And of course that would be of no benefit to those physically dead, those now in eternity, many of whom, if we think about it, were eternally lost. God says throughout this chapter and throughout the book, it says, "You will know that I am Jehovah." You can imagine that for those living, that was a great thing, though a terrible thing, to say, this is my God acting. For those who had died in their sins, they know who Jehovah is, and they know that they have no hope, and they know that everything they worked towards in their sinful state was of no value to them. Now he's saying, this multitude, I will open your graves. You people look at yourselves as having no hope. There's nothing left. We're going to die here in captivity. He's saying, you have all the hope in the world. You have something that your companions who died cannot have. So rather than despairing, cursing God, or feeling like there's nothing left, he's saying, I'm giving you a second opportunity. Some of them would certainly die in captivity, but for their descendants, they would have a new hope, and we know they would come back to the land. So it says, you will come back to the land. You will once again dwell in this land. And then he gets down to verses 15 through 23, and we have the idea of the two sticks. And I want to talk about this a little bit because I know there's a misunderstanding, especially I don't tend to mention denominations by name very much, but by their doctrines. But in this case, if you are familiar with the Latter-day Saints, they are sometimes referred to as Mormons, this is a passage they misunderstand, and I know this because I've talked to them. But we need to understand properly what God is saying, because if we don't, if we take their understanding of it, we can get a very corrupted idea of what God is saying, and it can diminish the capacity of what God is telling them. So let's look at first at what is being said, and then go back through and discuss what is meant versus what is not meant. It says, Jehovah came unto me again, saying in verse 15, and he tells him, I want you to take two sticks. On the one stick, I want you to write this phrase, for Judah and for the children of Israel, his companions. And upon the other stick, I want you to write, for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. And join them for thee one to another into one stick, that they may become one in your hand. Take some rope, take something, and tie them together. Now, for those in this particular denomination, or what you want to call them, they have the concept that the stick of Judah refers to those who would come back to physical Palestine to live in that physical Israel. And that for those of Ephraim, this actually refers to some Jews that at some point in history traveled across the ocean to the Americas and lived there as Jews in America. Now, we don't see anything in the Old Testament to tell us they did this. We don't see anything suggesting that God said that was okay. In fact, they were commanded to come to the feast days 3 times a year. Well, they didn't exactly have luxury liners to travel the oceans. So to come back 3 times a year would have been pretty hard. By the time you got there, you'd have to turn right back around. That would make no sense. And in fact, if we look, we often see this phrase of Joseph, of Ephraim, of Samaria, all referring to the same place, the northern kingdom and its capital. This is a way to describe to them the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, and he's saying, I'm going to bring you together into one nation. Now we know the northern kingdom never came back from captivity, but it's saying, as far as the remnant of any of those who might be left, as well as those of Judah who come back, there's not going to be this concept of a divided kingdom anymore. It's not so much about the physical nature of whose tribe you're from. He's saying, there's no longer going to be this division. I am doing away with that. You guys have split yourselves up for hundreds of years, and I allowed it to happen, even though that's not what I wanted. I allowed you to go forward, but we're destroying this concept. You've gone into captivity, and I need to get these notions out of your head. Your hope is not of being a divided people anymore. Your hope is of being a united people under me. So he takes these sticks, he puts them together, and of course the people are going to ask, well, what is with the sticks? Ezekiel, you've given us a lot of prophecies. What is with the sticks? And that's when he explains to them, you're going to be a united nation under me. And not like we think of the United Nations today, but of a united people under God. And we see that there's a purpose behind this when we get to the last part of the chapter, that of a singular king. We also know that after this time period, they no longer had a traditional kingdom like they had had before. Now we hear of King Agrippa when Paul speaks to him, and there was an idea of governors and of those who ruled over Israel under the Roman Empire, but they did not have a kingdom like they had before. The line of the northern tribes was gone, and the lineage of David was gone as far as a kingdom goes. There were still descendants of David, but not upon the throne until Jesus, and not of a physical throne. In fact, if we look in the Old Testament, you look up the man Coniah in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 1, he's called Jeconiah in the Old Testament. And it says, write down this man childless, one who will not prosper, sitting upon the throne of David, to say, this man will not rule physically, nor will his seed line. There is no physical kingdom left. There's a spiritual kingdom. I need you guys to get this notion out of your minds that you're going to go back to the land, and it's going to be like before, where you had a kingdom and you were restored to God's good graces, and now you serve him, and it's just like before. There's something different when you come back. There's hope, but this hope is different than what your ancestors knew. There's something coming that is far better. I need you to hear, and I need you to understand. So we get down to verse 24, and he says, and my servant David shall be king over them, and they all shall have one shepherd. They shall also walk in mine ordinances, and observe my statutes, and do them. And they shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers dwelt, and they shall dwell therein, they and their children, and their children's children forever. And David my servant shall be their prince forever. Moreover, I will make a covenant of peace with them, it shall be an everlasting covenant with them. And I will place them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore. My tabernacle also shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And the nations shall know that I am Jehovah that sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them forevermore. And so there's a certain physical attribute of you're coming back to the land to dwell and to rebuild your nation, but there's also a spiritual aspect to it. Verse 24, my servant David shall be king over them. Well, we know David's not being reincarnated. He's not being resurrected to life to rule. This must be somebody else. And of course, we know that David is a type for Christ. He stands in the place of. So you can understand, Christ as the king is similar to David. There's some attributes there. One who follows God with his whole heart. One who understands that he is not a king who is a tyrant, but rather he is a ruler of his people, helping them in their needs and seeing to it that they have their needs met. It also speaks of the idea of one shepherd. Now, it doesn't here describe it as a king who is also a shepherd, but we know Jesus is our king and our shepherd. So it's saying here's the two attributes, and we through time and through various passages see that they are one and the same. That if we look at John chapter 10, Jesus speaks of being the great shepherd, the good shepherd. That there are other shepherds and there's others who are hirelings. They come and they watch the sheep for money, but when an attack comes from a bear or a lion, they're nowhere to be seen because, hey, it's just a job. I didn't sign on to die for these sheep. I'm just here for the paycheck. And Jesus says, I'm not like that. I am the good shepherd. So he's telling them, there is one coming who is far better than any king you've had. So don't put your hope in these physical kings. I'm offering you something better. And then as though he's transitioning naturally in this dualistic nature, he uses the term forevermore more than once, and of an eternal everlasting covenant in verse 26. So he's saying, I'm showing you hope, that wherein you see no hope in this captivity, I'm bringing you into the land, and what I'm giving you is better than just the physical nation. What you have when you come back is far better. We know that from this time point on, they never again had idols like they had before. Or they may have had idols in their heart, things that they worshipped, but they never again went after the idol gods of the other nations. They didn't follow after the Greek gods, the Roman gods. They didn't have these statues set up in their homes or under the trees. They learned that lesson. So he's telling them, what I have for you is better than what you could hope for if you'll trust in me. I want you to see this king. And as he told him, I'm going to gather you from everywhere. Speaking of physical Israel, there's also a dualistic nature to this to say, I'm going to gather people from everywhere into my eternal kingdom, into my eternal nation, into the church as we know it today. I'm going to set this up, and what you have will be far better than you think. So not only do you have a little bit of hope, you have a better hope than any of your ancestors. And he uses these terms of an everlasting covenant, of a kingdom, of a servant, a king who will be prince forever, of having a tabernacle with the people, not just of a physical temple, but being with his people in their presence, and they being in his presence, having a relationship with the Almighty God. Not just that God's nebulously sitting up somewhere and we can't see him, but he's with you. So this refers to the church ultimately. So what Ezekiel is really telling them when he prophesies to these bones and they ask, what's with the bones? What's with the sticks? He's saying, while you see despair, God sees something far better. So today, as we look at this, we do see a dark message with a bright future. And we need to ask ourselves, where are we? Are we a dry bone? Are we just a dry bones sitting in a valley who say, there's nothing for me. God can't use me. I'm not good enough. What am I to God? I'm just going to do my best. I'm going to sit in the pew and then I'm going to go home and forget about it. Or are we one who says, you know what? If God can take dry bones with no life in them and restore them to full life, he can do the same for me. He can show me how to live for him. He can show me how to reach out to my neighbors, to my coworkers, to other people, to study with them, to teach them the gospel, to strengthen my brethren as well, to show them how they can also be useful for the master. Where are you in this process? If you have a need, if you find yourself like these dry bones, needing hope, needing prayers, if you have any need, please come as together we stand and as we sing.